Hello everyone, welcome to my art channel where we do painting tutorials. Like always, I start by taping down my paper with some masking tape just to make sure it stays flat as I paint. I start by applying some phthalo blue over the sky. Very randomly, I do not try to follow a certain pattern or order. I just want to cover it pretty much entirely with phthalo blue. And since I'm going to blend it, it's all going to end up being very smooth. And that's why I apply it in a random order. I just take my watercolor brush and I start applying water on random areas just to get it all covered up, and then I smooth it down going from left to right, all in the same direction in this last step. That is how I achieve my very smooth flat washes. And I take a tissue or some toilet paper, crumple it up, and I randomly tap on the wet background to add some soft clouds. While that dries, I take some earthy green and I color pretty much everything on my painting with it except for the lake. I'm applying a base layer of my main green that is not too dark and it's not too bright. I think it's just the perfect shade. If you do not have earthy green, you can substitute for olive green or sap green or any sort of a natural looking green color you may have. I quickly erase some of the pencil lines I did for my sketch with a kneaded eraser. That way you don't see black lines over the painting once it's finished. And I take some dark chrome yellow, which is this bright orange / dark yellow, and I apply it on top of all of the grassy areas, on top of all of the bushes and all of the trees to get a very soft highlight. Or maybe like it's autumn and the tops of the trees are starting to go yellow and orangey. You can interpret this however you want, it doesn't really matter. Then I take some helio blue reddish, which is my darkest blue, and I apply it beneath all of the trees there on top of the lake and also on the side. So I divide the big shape you see over the horizon with my blue to make smaller tree shapes. And then I just apply it on the bottom of that whole island. I'm not really sure what it is. On the bottom of that whole area, and I also use it beneath all of my grass blades there in the foreground and beneath all of the bushes, etc. Then I take some cadmium orange and I apply it directly on top of the helio blue, because blue and orange make a very nice dark color that is almost black, and it looks very neat. It looks very balanced on nature landscapes, as if I were to directly just apply some black on top of it. Then I take my watercolor brush with barely any water on it. I'm actually tapping my brush on my piece of tissue to take away the excess water. And I start blending from light to dark. So I start from the top of the trees with it with my dark yellow. Then I go to the green and then I do the blue-orange mix for last. I clean my brush as I switch from tree to tree. So every time I start a tree, I go from orange, green, blue. Then I clean my brush and I do the next tree again, orange, green, and blue. It doesn't really matter if you start from the left trees or from the right trees. Do whatever feels most comfortable to you. And you can use a round motion, a swirl motion, or just a tapping motion like a sewing needle. They all work for this style of painting because we're doing nature, and it's perfectly fine to have some texture. It's perfectly fine if your trees are not perfectly smooth. That's actually going to be a bit more helpful in my opinion, rather than just going in one big motion from the left side of the painting to the right side of the painting. Then for the grassy field we have on the bottom, I use the same exact technique. I start from the top where I laid my dark yellow, then I move to the green and to the tiny bits of blue I have beneath them. I first only do the grass that is peeking above the fence, and then lastly I do the big field we have on the bottom, and for that I do use big broad brush strokes going from the right side to the left side, because I want to be on the smoother side but not too smooth. If you have some bits, some lines, some random areas that are not perfectly smooth, it's okay. Like the one darker green line I have pretty much on the right side of the center. That is perfectly fine. And while that dries, again I take my phthalo blue and I apply it over the lake. I'm skipping some bits and I'm applying it rather randomly, but in horizontal strokes because it's a lake and I want it to be pretty much flat, pretty horizontal. And all of the areas that I skipped, I fill in with my earthy green because I want my trees that I did to be reflected on the lake. So I'm going to try and use the same colors I used for the trees on top of the lake. I take my cadmium orange and I apply it with my helio blue beneath all of the trees to add a stronger shadow. Just directly beneath each of the tree areas. And I take my watercolor brush and again I mostly dry it on the napkin. So it's maybe 60-70% on the dry side. I barely use any water for this. And I start blending from the tiny bits there between the logs that make up the fence. And then I blend the big area that we have between the fence and those trees. I'm using again horizontal brush strokes, and because I'm using very little water, once it starts to get pretty much on the dry side, once the brush starts getting very dry, it's going to skip some bits and it's going to leave some blank speckles, some blank spaces. Pretty much it's going to leave behind some white dots, which is going to mimic the way water tends to sparkle, and it's going to look very unnatural in my opinion. It's just an easy way to paint water. Lastly, I just do those blue and orange bits there under the trees, and that is it. Next, I take my yellow ochre and I color the top of the fence with it. Mind you, because I used very little water for the lake, it almost instantaneously dried on me, so I didn't have to wait in between. But the more water you use, the longer it's going to take to dry. So please keep that in mind. Then I take my walnut brown and I do the vertical logs that are holding the fence and also apply it lightly beneath all of the horizontal logs. Then with just the tip of the brush, I go over the fence, just following the lines. It's okay if some of the dark walnut brown goes on top of the yellow ochre or vice versa, it doesn't really matter. What I suggest is leaving some of those green bits, some of those green bushes on the foreground, go on top of the fence here and there so it looks a bit more realistic rather than just having all of those bushes covered up by the fence. I take my helio blue reddish and I apply it beneath the fence as a shadow very lightly, just some very light strokes, and then for any blank areas of that grassy field we have that are left over, I just go over them with my earthy green. Then I take again my helio blue reddish, which is my darkest blue, and I try to separate the big tree shapes in that big blotch of foliage and trees and forest we have above the lake. I just sort of sketch them out, I frame them out, I separate them one from the other. And I apply some more shadows on the bushes there along the fence line. Then I take my walnut brown and I add some very tiny lines for tree trunks and some branches. Just make some very tiny lines on the bottom and then some diagonal lines for branches. They're more towards the top of the trees. And if drawing is not your thing, there is going to be a traceable to this and all of my other tutorials over at my Patreon page, Sunshine Arts, and by doing so you also help support me and the channel. And like always, all of the supplies used and the reference picture I used as inspiration for this painting will be linked down below as well. And back to our painting, I just keep on filling any blank spaces upon the grass with my earthy green. Then I add more shadows with my helio blue. Once I'm happy with it, I take my watercolor brush, I get some water just on the tip and I lightly press on the areas I just did with my Helio Blue. That way I activate them and I don't blend them. What that means is I'm just going to make the color a bit more saturated by applying a tiny amount of water on top of it, but it's still going to keep that shape and texture and help me separate my trees. Lastly, I take my dark yellow and I do a very light layer on top of my grassy field, and then I proceed to take off the tape. I clean up any of the lines from my pencil sketch. They're outside the painting with a normal eraser. And I don't know if you can tell, a bit of the blue from the sky bleeded under the tape. So I take an eraser pencil, which is basically an eraser within the body of a pencil, and I use that to erase the paint. It's just a bit sturdier and it has a bit better control than a normal eraser, and that is why I prefer to use it for this kind of work. I'd like to give a very special thank you to my patrons for the month of April, and thank you all for watching. We will see each other in the next video. Bye bye!